right, beautiful boomers. Introducing Leo Axt. The talk, Yes, We Ban. 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winner ICANN on the journey towards banning nuclear weapons. So Leo's the kind of guy who's here to make history and inspire us to believe in our wildest dreams. Okay, this is a tall order. You're gonna have to live up to this. So he's brave enough to challenge the higher powers in the EU Parliament in Brussels, and skillful enough to bring the battle to the UN, win it, and ergo earn the Nobel Peace Prize. He is, oh, this is my favorite. He is pirate enough to come back from all of this, take off the suit and tie, liminal, move through borders and spaces, and come here to the dustiest psychedelic festival and bring us the intel. So I'd love a boombastic welcome to the stage for Leo Axt.
Thanks. Well, thanks for that hilarious introduction. No pressure at all. It's great to be here. Apparently, you've had a very long day of talks, and indeed, we're shifting gears a bit. And I'm going to try and not overdo it on the abstract political bullshit on that we get usually on why nuclear weapons are a great thing, and try and connect it to a more reasonable reality, where we're just trying to figure out how we can work with the political system that we have and try to get some change along the way. And try and also kind of connect it to how we sort of stumbled into this process and how this all kind of happened to us as much as with us. It's been, as Ivan was saying, it's been an absolutely crazy 5 years basically, and we, in our wildest dreams, we couldn't imagine that it would be this fast and this direct, the path to getting there. So starting off, for those of you who don't know, ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, it's a huge organization and it's a tiny organization. We're actually 5-6 people in Geneva, but then we have a lot of partner organizations everywhere in the world. So that's about 400 partners in 100 countries, a bit everywhere as shown on the map. So that means that you have this little, team coordinating in the middle, and then everybody else does a bit what they can, and everybody is independent politically, legally, financially, and so on. And I kind of stumbled into ICANN for the first time in 2010, and my first instinct was to make fun of their name. So basically, I thought, well, hang on, ICANN is kind of a combination of Apple's egocentric product marketing and Obama's campaign slogan. But actually, it turns out they were founded in 2007, so apparently it has nothing to do with either the iPhone or Obama. Nonetheless, basically, this is the situation. I was a student. I was in the second semester. We had this opportunity to go to the United Nations and check out the disarmament diplomacy, what the diplomats hanging out there and doing their various negotiations on what to do about nuclear weapons. And we went there in basically tourist mode. I mean, we wanted to raise awareness, we wanted to make interviews, we wanted to film them doing it, put it on the website, explain to people what's going on, in order to create a bit of pressure for the diplomats to get their act together, given that for many decades there had been almost no progress whatsoever on nuclear disarmament. And it was fairly obvious to us, even though we were quite young and had absolutely no clue of how the United Nations works, it was fairly obvious that this was a dysfunctional process, nothing was moving, and you needed kind of a new idea to move things along. And then we bumped into ICANN, and they had a completely different approach to this, and before long, obviously, we were teaming up with them and then basically founding ICANN in Germany. This year is in 2013. That was when we decided to do this. Together with my flatmate, basically, we set up ICANN in our living room and didn't even register an NGO or anything. We just claimed that we had put up ICANN and just started taking meetings with politicians, partner organizations, humanitarians, the Red Cross, Oxfam, Greenpeace, all the people that you'd try to get on board and whose support you would need to try and move the conversation along. And this was not the most difficult task, perhaps, because at the end of the day, everybody agrees that nuclear weapons are a bad thing. They are basically the worst of the weapons of mass destruction. We've already prohibited under international law biological and chemical weapons. Biological weapons were banned in 1973, and then chemical weapons were banned with a treaty in 1993, so just after the Cold War. And for some reason, the biggest weapons had not been banned. They're still sort of legal under international law. And that's kind of, on the one hand, unacceptable, because obviously you want to do everything in their power to get rid of the worst weapons ever known to mankind. On the other hand, the people who really like nuclear weapons, they say, well, yeah, duh, they're so bad, nobody's ever going to use them, right? And that's when you get into these awful deterrence arguments and why you should have nuclear weapons, because that's the only way that you keep them from being used. And that's an interesting argument, and one that you definitely have to entertain, because you want to take everybody along. You want to convince also those who actually cling to nuclear weapons, and you can't just, I mean, here in Boom, this is the nice part about it. Now we can all agree that nuclear weapons are bad. There's very little conversation to be had on that. Whereas in the real life, whatever corner bar you walk into, you always have like a lot of experts sitting at the counter telling you why your job is useless and you shouldn't be banning nuclear weapons because have you never thought about deterrence? And of course, deterrence works most of the time. So let's say in 95% of cases and 99% of cases, yeah, sure, the other guy has a gigantic weapon, like a big clumsy bomb, and so I'm not going to attack them because they might wipe out our entire country. But then we have like a dozen arguments or a dozen historical instances where nuclear deterrence didn't work. So countries got attacked even though they had nuclear weapons. So Israel got attacked in the 1970s. The Falkland or Malvinas Islands were attacked by Argentina even though the UK had nuclear weapons. In the Korea War in the 1950s, the Chinese got involved in the war even though the United States had nuclear weapons and had threatened to use them in the Korean context. And there's a bunch of more arguments like that. So clearly nuclear deterrence is not watertight. But then what happens if anything would go wrong? If you have just one nuclear weapon used, you would have about 500,000, 2 million people dead within a week or two. Civilians, obviously. So this is a weapon that is optimized and designed to kill as many civilians as possible. But of course, you never just use one nuclear weapon. The policies state that once you've been attacked, you have to use everything that you have, because either you use your weapons or you lose them. These are the two options. So basically, you then have an all-out attack with hundreds of nuclear weapons used, and that would be ending the life on the planet, basically, not just for humans, but also for animals and also for most species of plants. But the more realistic scenarios may be the recurring wars between India and Pakistan, and modern climate models predict that if India and Pakistan were both to use 50 nuclear weapons, which is about half of their stockpile, then we would have so much smoke and so much soot going into the atmosphere in such a high layer that the rain cannot get rid of it. So the smoke and the soot would stay there for 10 years in the upper layers of the atmosphere and would make sure that 10% less sunlight would come in, and you'd basically have global famine. 1 billion to 2 billion people would probably starve to death, and this would be mostly in the most vulnerable countries in the global south. Those that obviously have least to do with nuclear weapons, because none of them actually has nuclear weapons, they would be the ones to bear the consequences of this the most. That's in the scenario of a war with nuclear weapons. But the most likely way that nuclear weapons will be used again is actually an accident or miscalculation or miscommunication. So this might sound far-fetched, but actually it happens all of the time. So we have 15,000 nuclear weapons, 15,000 across the world, and these are 15,000 angles of attack for an accident. That means you have 15,000 of these machines, physical machines that are carried around, that are moved around, that are cleaned, that are kept ready at a moment's notice. And obviously the soldiers who are moving them around are among the least motivated in the entire military, because they kind of assume that their weapons will never be used. So we have all kinds of statistics that they have higher likelihoods to to abuse their spouses, they have higher likelihoods to fail their tests, to not show up for work, and so on. These are studies that have been leaked to the media. And then we also have accounts of over 1,000 accidents, serious accidents involving nuclear weapons, where they have fallen off a plane by accident, where planes have crashed with nuclear weapons on board, where a rocket has exploded because it was punctured from the side from a tool, and then the nuclear weapon flew a few hundred meters away. We had all kinds of instances like that. We had computer chips malfunctioning. We had test tapes that simulate an attack that were introduced inadvertently, and the people in the room who then were initiating the steps to counterattack Russia didn't notice that this was just a test tape that was being played. And these are the 1,000 accidents and incidents that we know of, are the ones that happened in the UK and in the United States. So we don't know of the accidents in Russia, in Pakistan, in Israel, in India. We don't know what accidents happened in China or in France, for that matter. So these are all top secret, obviously. You don't want to tell the world, oops, we almost blew up half the planet. Because that would kind of decrease further people's support for weapons of mass destruction. So obviously something will go wrong. Just in January, for example, there was they sent out a message, a text message to all of the inhabitants of Hawaii, saying, "Danger, missile incoming. This is not a drill." So all of the inhabitants of Hawaii knew that they had approximately 20 minutes to live. And they basically put their children in the sewage, and they made phone calls to people, to their loved ones, saying goodbye. They did all kinds of crazy and extraordinary stuff that you would do when you think there's no accountability and this is your last moment on Earth. And this is the kind of miscalculation that also leads to counterattack, because you don't need a real attack if you want to trigger a counterattack. No? So this is all rather dangerous. And that's why I think it's well encapsulated by Einstein, who already in the 50s said, I do not know what, in the 40s, sorry, what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And then, of course, Greenpeace made this hilarious call that history should not retweet itself. This was back last year, in 2017. And that brings me to a funny parable here, because 2017 for us at ICANN was an absolutely amazing year. So while the world was reeling of the fact that this lunatic had taken over the most powerful nation on the earth, we were actually quite happy. We got our treaties through. I'm going to get to that in a moment. The goal of our campaign was suddenly accomplished. And of course, we also had our most effective ambassador, Trump, and North Korea, reminding everybody that nuclear weapons are still a thing and that we should still be afraid of them. So let's go back a few steps about the status quo. What were people doing about nuclear weapons in the last few decades? After the Cold War, I think most people forgot about nuclear weapons. There was basically no campaigns against it. There was barely any NGOs, any citizen mobilization against nuclear weapons. Basically because after Russia and the United States were no longer threatening to attack each other the entire time, the assumption went, well, okay, so now we're safe and nothing can go wrong. People didn't think about the accidents that are happening, and also didn't think about the fact that now North Korea also has nuclear weapons, Pakistan, India, there was a lot of proliferation, and now it's not a bilateral deterrence relationship, that was maybe a bit more predictable, but now you have 9 nuclear weapon states that are all threatening each other, and it's a bit more unstable there. But since 1968, we had the famous Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Maybe many of you will have heard of it. And the NPT basically strikes a bargain. Most states cannot have nuclear weapons, and the 5 that already did can sort of keep them, even though they had to promise to disarm. And then, of course, nothing happened. So the 5 nuclear weapon states were basically playing for time, procrastinating, making promises, making tactical concessions, trying to create the impression that, yes, they're totally disarming, but then at the same time investing massive amounts of money into nuclear weapons. So at the moment, the United States, for example, is going to invest in the next 30 years $1 trillion. So it's $1,000 billion in nuclear weapons. That's the baseline scenario. So now with Trump having already announced that there's going to be further increases and new weapons developed, that's more likely to be $1.6 trillion in the end. And just in the next 10 years, it's going to be $400 billion. And that's just the United States. All of the other nuclear weapon states are also heavily investing in their nuclear weapons and making clear that they plan to rely on weapons of mass destruction for decades to come until probably the end of the 21st century. So obviously the NPT was not doing the trick. The NPT, by the way, was this super boring conference that we went to in 2010, where we were like, okay guys, if this is how you're dealing with nuclear weapons, then we seriously have a problem. We have to completely change the game and completely change the framework in which we talk about nuclear weapons. And one of the ways to maybe quickly encapsulate just how dysfunctional the whole debate in the NPT was is that basically you have this treaty. The treaty says you should disarm your nuclear weapons, and then you meet every year in gigantic conferences in New York, at the United Nations, in Vienna, and Geneva, and the states come together, and they can't agree on whether nuclear weapons should be A, legal, or B, illegal. Or C, illegal for some, but not for others. And so if you think that nuclear weapons are legal, then obviously states should leave the NPT and develop nuclear weapons themselves. But that doesn't seem to be a good option. If you think they are illegal, then obviously you should negotiate a treaty that ends this ambiguity and declares nuclear weapons clearly illegal. And if you think that they should be legal for some, but not for others, then probably you're Portugal or Germany or another NATO member state, or you're one of the nuclear weapon states. And then the question for you is, how long do you think you can get away with it? So basically, we had to become a little bit more drastic in our efforts to try and reach the diplomats, because most countries on Earth don't really have enough diplomats to really follow all of these processes in a way that would allow them to become creative and really reframe these diplomatic processes. I know that from the very beginning, because before I got involved with ICANN, I was actually working as a diplomat at the United Nations for the Republic of Nauru. Who's heard of the Republic of Nauru? Very nice. I hear you. It's a tiny, tiny island nation on the other side of the planet in the Pacific. And they have about 10,000 inhabitants. They don't even have a university. So it's a bit difficult for them to make their voice heard at the United Nations. And so they get people like us to kind of go there and support them. And for them, obviously, I mean, they're not going to get into the detail and the minutiae of the NPT and why it's not working and why the United States are not disarming and so on and so forth. And instead of getting into all of those arguments where really they're trying to procrastinate basically and play for time, we were asking diplomats in more polite terms to cut the crap and just ban nuclear weapons. Because until you don't agree that nuclear weapons are a bad thing, something to be ashamed of, if you don't agree on the actual goal of getting to zero nuclear weapons, then you're never going to actually start out on the lengthy process, on the many difficult, complicated technical steps that you have to agree on along the way, creating the confidence that this is actually going to happen. So about 72 years after nuclear weapons were first used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, 72 years after the United Nations had passed its first resolution calling for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, 72 years after, we were finally in a place where we could try and get nuclear weapons prohibited. But obviously, this was quite a difficult process to get off the ground. At the United Nations, you have 193 different governments that are represented. And basically, you have to get them all on board, and you have to get them all on board at the same time, so that they actually give each other a date and a place and a time to come together and have the courage to negotiate a new treaty. And if the most powerful states on Earth are trying to keep this from happening, then you need friends that are going to help you get this process off the ground. And so that's why here you have Austria, Norway, and Mexico, 3 random countries that just had diplomats who were extremely visionary, who were quite ideological and idealistic. They had a bunch of diplomats in the right spot in their foreign ministry who really wanted to get nuclear weapons prohibited. And they got together and hashed out a process, and from the very beginning worked together with ICANN in order to broaden this group and get everybody else into the fold. One of those diplomats, actually the most famous of them, is the guy here on the right. Here you can see him on my terrace in Brussels when we were celebrating the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's basically the father of the ban treaty. He was also voted the Arms Control Person of the Year in 2014 for having organized this Vienna conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And he's just one of the most amazing ambassadors that I've ever come across. He still works for Austria, so he's an Austrian ambassador and has to be always very balanced and boring in his remarks. But he's one of the most effective campaigners that I know. And so we set out trying to convince the nations of the world that this is the time to ban nuclear weapons and to participate in this initiative that was led by Norway, Austria, and Mexico. And as you can see on this map, after 2-3 years of running around the United Nations with lists of all the states, trying to sign them up, asking them, are you going to sign up for this initiative? If not, can you give us your phone number? We're going to call you again tomorrow. Please check with your capital if you can really not join this statement of the so-called humanitarian initiative. And after 2-3 years of doing that, we had 150 states from the global south. And as you can see here, in the north, it was not looking so rosy. So in the EU, most states were opposed to this. Canada, United States, China, Japan, Russia, and Australia were all opposed to this process. But this didn't keep us from pressing ahead. And in fact, this was really the turning point of the campaign, where basically we already had a vast majority of nations on Earth, and still nothing was happening, because it took another year and a half until we had gathered the courage for all of these states to really pass a resolution in the United Nations telling them, okay, let's set date for the conference on the negotiation of this treaty for next year. And the main reason for that was that this is the first time in history that the states of the global south came together and passed a treaty against the active opposition of the most powerful, of the richest, and of the most industrialized nations of the world. So while the United States and Europeans, France, UK, were all leaning very heavily on states in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America, and even threatening them with economic consequences, really post-colonial behavior. These states were not to be discouraged and really stuck together, and thanks also to the pressure and to us always bringing together the people so that they would be aware of the fact that also these other states were equally wanting to go ahead with the process and were equally not going to let the northern state keep them from going ahead. We managed in 2016 to pass a resolution at the United Nations that was then going to set the negotiations. And from that moment on, it was smooth sailing. So everybody sort of agreed on the basic concept of the treaty. And within 2 months of negotiations in 2017, we had the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted. And here you see all of the states voting in favor of it, so that's the vast majority. The only state that voted against, incidentally, is the Netherlands. Sorry for the Dutch people here. Some more work to do. No, but the real reason for this is that the Netherlands were actually the only country from NATO that participated in the negotiations, while all of the other countries, including Portugal, including Spain, including Germany, Italy, and so on, were boycotting the negotiations from the get-go, and were also pressuring other states not to participate in these negotiations. Which is cute, because basically if you ask Portuguese politicians or German politicians, they will all tell you that of course they are against nuclear weapons, and of course they're working for a world without nuclear weapons. And usually they get away with it. So the parliamentarians actually believe this because they don't think so much about nuclear weapons, and they are told by the foreign ministry that, yeah, sure, we're for a world without nuclear weapons. And the journalists believe it because, well, all of these processes, it's NPT, it kind of sounds very technical and complicated, and they don't really trust you if you, as an NGO campaigner, go to the journalist and say, hey, here we have a treaty that's going to be adopted next year, and your state is kind of against it. We actually didn't get a lot of traction with media. First, because they thought nuclear weapons were not that interesting. Second, because they thought this was not going to happen. And thirdly, because to some extent they probably believed their politicians and their government that they were already doing everything they could against nuclear weapons. Whereas it turns out all of these NATO states, European states, were boycotting the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and still to this day are boycotting the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, we in July 2017, the 7th of July 2017, had a huge party then in New York where we were celebrating with all of our buddies from the negotiating conference and from all of the states from all over the world having adopted this historical agreement. And this was a little installation that we did for the party after the conference. And here you have the treaty. So on the left, yeah, fine UN treaty, and on the right, we all signed it with all the campaigners and all of the diplomats involved in the treaty to kind of celebrate that moment. And now we are working to get this treaty signed and ratified. So of course, most states in the world are going to do that quite quickly. But here we zoom in on Europe, and here we see that basically most states are still against this. There's some exceptions. There's the Vatican, there's San Marino, there's Liechtenstein, Austria, Switzerland, Ireland. They are all in favor of this. Malta and Cyprus are in the process. Sweden is in the process. And the others are all opposing it. And it's going to be a bit difficult because basically NATO has promised them to defend them with nuclear weapons. And that's why they kind of feel that they have to protect the nuclear weapons of NATO against the threat of being delegitimized. And that is basically what I have to work on a day-to-day basis, to kind of go to all of these conferences and parliaments and try and convince politicians that nuclear weapons are so bad and deterrence is so dangerous that they cannot keep on playing for time, but that they have to join this treaty. The issue here is that most politicians actually agree with this. The only reason why they're not doing anything about it is because they're afraid of the United States, and they're afraid of the diplomatic pressure and the awkward questions that they're going to get if they try to branch out from NATO policy. And now with Trump being all crazy within NATO and so on, they are afraid of provoking this lunatic. And so they don't really feel it in themselves to now change their policy and change their approach to nuclear weapons. And they use all kinds of weird arguments for that. So just 2 weeks ago, ICANN was invited to the Nato Summit. And that's a bit weird for us, because we don't usually get invited to these things. But now, I guess with the Nobel Peace Prize, you sort of have more visibility, and they can't really get away with not inviting us. And then many of our partner NGOs didn't want us to go because they don't like NATO. They think we shouldn't be seen there, kind of legitimizing those processes and so on. But at the end of the day, most governments on Earth agree with us, and the ones that we still have to convince happen to be the NATO governments and the nuclear weapon states. So this presents us with an uncomfortable situation to have to show up there and be in a room where we are the only ones who oppose nuclear weapons, and then try and explain to them from the very basics why this is a bad idea. At the same time, it's also not that difficult, because the arguments that they use against nuclear weapons are absolutely ludicrous. NATO is quite post-truth when it comes to nuclear weapons. They like to talk about disinformation and how they have to fight all kinds of disinformation wars and hybrid warfare and so on and so forth. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, this is what they say. Don't want to bore you too much with these political statements, but basically NATO, on the day when our treaty was open for ratification, all of the NATO heads of state and government issued a statement together saying that the ban treaty will not be effective, will not reduce nuclear arsenals, and it risks doing the opposite and destabilizing the world. It risks undermining the NPT when actually it does the exact opposite, and they cannot support this treaty for all those reasons. Actually, we have already seen that the treaty is extremely effective. In fact, in the letter that the United States sent to all of the governments that they were pressuring to boycott this treaty, they were saying that the treaty is going to be effective in delegitimizing nuclear weapons and in making it more difficult for the United States to sustain its nuclear deterrent and sustain protection for NATO states and so on. So they have actually agreed with us and acknowledged that this is going to be politically effective. Then, of course, it's going to be legally effective, because now all United Nations agencies, the World Health Organization, the Red Cross, and all kinds of other institutions that are neutral will be able to point towards this treaty and say that they can no longer cooperate with any entities that are involved in nuclear weapons and can no longer be seen to support any of that. And of course, all of the states that have ratified this treaty, banks which are in those states, can no longer finance any organizations, any companies that are involved in nuclear weapons or in delivery vehicles or in maintenance or production thereof. So already we're seeing massive divestments by pension funds, by sovereign wealth funds from Norway, even the Netherlands, even though the Netherlands is boycotting this treaty, you already have banks in Belgium, Germany, France, Switzerland, who are already divesting from nuclear weapons as a result of this treaty. And you have massive outflows of money from those companies. And that, of course, they're going to find money somewhere else, but it's going to be making it more difficult for them. And it's going to remind all of the shareholders that, hang on, there's a problem here. We're still investing in weapons of mass destruction. And so via the back door, in a way, through all of these processes, we're going to make it more difficult to justify having weapons of mass destruction and going to ever more encircle the enterprise. And also politicians who have a problem with nuclear weapons will have more legal arguments, will have more moral arguments against these armaments. And that is actually the most important part, because nuclear weapons at the end of the day are symbolic weapons. They're not really supposed to be used. So what you need to do is you need to take the symbolism away. You need to take the prestige away that are conferred upon them. You need to not make them a status symbol, like Trump last year. Trump thought he can increase his status, he can increase his ego, by threatening to kill millions of innocent civilians. Now, if we codified international law that nuclear weapons are unacceptable, then over the years, in the next 10, 20 years, the next generation of politicians, journalists, and so on, will not just think that that is normal, but will be absolutely horrified by the fact that this guy is even able to say things like that. And people will start being ashamed of nuclear weapons rather than being proud of them or thinking that they confer prestige. So this is a slow process of really changing attitude, changing minds. And this is the only way that you can really eradicate nuclear weapons, because frankly, nuclear weapons are 1940s technology. So anybody, any state can get their hands on nuclear weapons. Even North Korea, one of the poorest nations on Earth, completely isolated by sanctions, even they were able to get nuclear weapons. And so any state that is committed and has a dictator that is crazy enough, obviously they can get nuclear weapons if they want to. And the only way that we're going to slow this down and make sure that we all converge on not having nuclear weapons is by really, in an intellectual way, convincing them morally and also with political arguments that this is just not a good idea. And if you think about it, I mean, of course, the 9 nuclear weapon states, they don't agree. But 184 countries on Earth do not have nuclear weapons and don't intend to get nuclear weapons. So for them, they already have understood that it makes no sense to have them. Then, of course, there's a few outliers, there's a few processes here and there, so we're quite worried that Iran, for example, had a military nuclear program. And then, of course, we should also try to make sure that that doesn't happen. At the same time, we have to be aware of the irony that Iran is sitting down at a negotiating table with 5 nuclear weapon states in Germany, all of which rely on nuclear weapons for their security, and they are then explaining to Iran that Iran is not able to do the same thing. That while Portugal, Belgium, Germany are just surrounded by friends and have absolutely no geopolitical tensions, whereas Iran obviously has a very different security environment, and it's possible that some people within Iran come to the conclusion that they should have the same strategy to assure their security as the United States, as the UK, as other nuclear weapon states. So this is really a process that is ongoing, and frankly, I think this is pretty unstoppable at the moment. Portugal and Germany, sure, they're still saying that they cannot join the nuclear weapons ban treaty because they are in NATO and because the NATO policy doesn't allow them to ban nuclear weapons. That's not true. The NATO treaty doesn't even mention nuclear weapons, and you can always have an opt-out from these extended deterrents. It was the same for landmines. It was the same for cluster munitions. Some states were just a lot faster in ratifying those treaties. Then NATO was like, okay, fine, you guys banned those weapons, so I suppose we have to now have a more flexible arrangement for our terms of engagement, and we have to adopt policies whereby if we have a joint NATO mission, we're not going to use cluster munitions, we're not going to use landmines. And for nuclear weapons, it's going to be the same. If you don't want nuclear weapons to be used in the event that you get attacked, you just tell your NATO partners, please, in case we get attacked, don't nuke anybody. We're not going to care with that already. So, and then you have your opt-out. It's quite a political, symbolic step to take. And then in the case of Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Turkey, you also have to withdraw the nuclear weapons that are stationed on their territory, and they have to stop training the dropping of those weapons because pilots from all of those countries are currently still have planes that are specifically designed to drop nuclear weapons and are training that on an ongoing basis. But quite frankly, here this is a photo on the right where you have this wonderful rainbow coming down. This was just a few weeks ago. We went to Germany to the base where the nuclear weapons are stored, and we blockaded the base from the outside and did a few talks on how to get the treaty ahead from our camp outside the base. And the moment when we arrived at the base, here was a rainbow hitting really this is you couldn't make this stuff up, right? Hitting the silo with the nuclear weapons in the background, which is just there behind those trees. So I think this was a nice symbol to see. The arch of history may be long, but eventually everybody agrees that weapons of mass destruction are not a good thing. And of course, having won the Nobel Peace Prize kind of helps because it gives us visibility and gives us a lot more credibility in the arguments. And this way, we are going to get, within the next 5 to 10 years, I think, most states on board for the nuclear weapons ban treaty. And from that moment on, it's going to be a lot easier to put pressure on the nuclear weapon states to get their act together and understand that our patience has run out and we're no longer going to accept that they procrastinate on getting rid of the super dangerous weapons of mass destruction in a misguided effort to secure their security while taking the rest of humanity hostage. Thank you. And now the idea was to do a Q&A in case you want to just elaborate on specific topics on that. I think we still have some time. And otherwise, on Thursday, we're also going to do a workshop over there in the NGO space. So we can talk more about what specific actions we can take in order to really put pressure on your specific governments or how to mobilize people around wherever you're coming from, Portugal and other nuclear weapon dependent states.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Hello. Right, so I want to know if this treaty is something that the veto countries can veto, and if not, why not, and if yes, what's stopping them?
That's, very good. Very good question. So usually, yes, usually nuclear weapons are negotiated, are discussed in forums where the nuclear weapon states have a veto. And there's quite a series of those. So you have the United Nations Security Council, of course. So the United Nations Security Council is never going to adopt a resolution that says, okay, let's all disarm because of the veto. Secondly, I spoke earlier about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. There you have every 5 years a big-ass review conference where all of the states come together, all the states that ratified it, which are 189, I think. And they come together to basically check on whether the agreement has been implemented and then to negotiate an outcome document where they promise each other steps to take, an action plan, things like that. All kinds of great steps that are always adopted by consensus and that don't get implemented because of the procrastination of the nuclear armed. So those documents are also negotiated by consensus. Consensus is not the same thing as veto. Consensus just means everybody should agree, but they tend to abuse the consensus rule and interpret it as a veto, and then they just veto it if they don't like the provisions because they're too ambitious. And then there's a third forum. It's the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. It's a sub-body of the United Nations, and the Conference of Disarmament is a scandal in and of itself, quite separate scandal. They have not been able to agree on a program of work for 20 years. Actually 22, since 1996. So since 1996, you have diplomats from all over the world coming together in Geneva and sitting there together in sessions that last for months, wasting taxpayers' money, basically doing nothing, blocking each other, just sitting around doing nothing. And that's because of the veto, obviously. So you always have a few states that say, nah, let's not talk about that. And that's the kinds of arguments that we were using was the member states of the United Nations saying, well, hang on, I mean, you can't possibly think that this is how we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. Obviously, we have to take a process that doesn't give a comfortable veto-wielding chair to every nuclear weapon state. Obviously, if you want to ban nuclear weapons, you're going to have to do it with people who don't have nuclear weapons. It's not like you wait for the smokers to come up with a smoking ban, right? So I understand that if you have nuclear weapons, sure, you don't want people to come and tell you your toy is now illegal, right? So we had to work with the overwhelming majority of states that don't have nuclear weapons in order to change international law, change the system, change the framework, so that now we can put pressure on the nuclear weapon states, shame them, and delegitimize their weapons. So the key was really to find a process and find an institution where we could operate without a veto. And this was the United Nations General Assembly. So the General Assembly operates by majority voting. And via a resolution in the General Assembly, we were able to kick off the conference where then this treaty was going to be negotiated.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Juliana, and I have well, first of all, congratulations and for what the Peace Nobel Prize represents. And you're welcome. So I was a volunteer at Mayors for Peace.
Nice.
You probably heard about it. And I was in 2009 in the UN for the revision of the NPT.
Mm-hmm. In New York.
Yeah, in New York. Maybe you were there somewhere.
I was there in 2010 the first time, actually.
Okay. I have two questions. First of all, one of the arguments is always like dismantle nukes. It's a very, let's say, expensive process. I don't know if you can elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm.
And also about like what's the real danger from the dirty bombs that we are facing today? Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, so this gives a bit of a first peek into the kind of weird arguments that people come up with, no? So some people say, well, maybe it's too expensive to get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, I mean, if something threatens humanity, then it doesn't really matter how much it costs, right? You just have to do it. But that's an answer that would actually acknowledge the argument. Obviously, it's not at all expensive to dismantle nuclear weapons. It's much more expensive to maintain nuclear weapons. For deterrence to be credible, you have to always create the impression and show to your enemies that you are able and willing to push the button within 2 minutes. That you have submarines at sea 24/7, that you have intercontinental ballistic missiles everywhere stationed in your country, that you have bombers that are ready to go fully with their tank full and with the nuclear weapons loaded so that you can immediately start off. And the worst thing are, in fact, the submarines, because they don't come up for 3 months, and you have the whole oceans full of these submarines loaded with nuclear weapons that could end the world completely with just the weapons that they have on board. So obviously this is super expensive. And dismantling nuclear weapons in comparison, look, I mean, you just have to kind of open up the bomb, get rid of the technical components, and then you have the core, the plutonium or the uranium core, and I mean, the core, you just have to oxidize it with some other chemicals in order to render it useless. That's not a particularly expensive process. Yeah, sure, you come up with some radioactive, shitty components, but it's not as bad as nuclear energy, actually, because nuclear energy, the fuel rods, they are properly radioactive, whereas plutonium and uranium cores, they're not very radioactive at all, so even in disposing of those things, not that bad. There's no technical problems here. It's really just political problems. Also on verification or on doing it at the same time and so on. These are all arguments that people use when they want to procrastinate. Making hypothetical questions about how we're going to do it when you have 100 nuclear weapons and I have 100 nuclear weapons. I don't actually care how we're going to do it. We have 15,000, so let's think about that when we have 500. And for now, let's just drastically and quickly reduce the numbers. And then for the last few dozens, just give each other a phone call. These things have all been tried out already. There is verification measures. There is confidence building measures going on between the nuclear weapon states. They are perfectly capable of organizing a process whereby they can assure each other that they no longer have nuclear weapons. The good thing about nuclear weapons is that you need a huge industrial infrastructure in order to create them. So it's much easier to detect nuclear breakout than it is to detect biological or chemical weapons. For chemical weapons, you just need an underground kitchen. For biological weapons, you just need to go rogue in one of your many medical labs. For nuclear weapons, you have to have a huge infrastructure to enrich uranium, or you have to steal some of the plutonium from the verified sites where the UN inspectors are verifying it on an ongoing basis. So you're always going to be caught either with satellite imagery or because of the UN inspectors. So cost or technical issues don't really register. And the second question, I forgot?
Dirty bombs.
Ah, yeah, dirty bombs. That's yeah. That's a huge thing, obviously. I mean, but that's not really connected to nuclear weapons. Basically, if you have radiological material, if you can steal some spent fuel from nuclear power plants, and you just bump a bit of TNT or an explosive around it, and then you just make the radioactive stuff go up in the air, and you do it in a city, then yeah, you can contaminate a city like New York so badly that they have to evacuate half of the city, and the radioactivity would be so big, and people would take precautions that basically would disrupt the city for months, and they would just have to kind of evacuate it. But you don't need nuclear weapons for that. In fact, a nuclear weapon would be really badly suited for that because it's not radioactive enough, because the plutonium and uranium is not so active in sending off neutrons and other radiation. So usually it would be much easier to go to one of the many test sites in Kazakhstan or somewhere else and gather some of the earth and dust there and make it go off in a city, or maybe steal some spent fuel from one of the many nuclear plants, and then you can make a radiological bomb with that. That's a huge threat. It's quite dangerous. It's a lot. It's one of the many problems we're facing with the nuclear fuel cycle, basically.
Hello, I wanted to know if you're also working on banning nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, actually ICANN is a very specific campaign, so we've always been focused very much on this UN treaty. So it depends really. In states where there's a strong civil society working on nuclear energy, there we're very happy to cooperate with them and try to put pressure on the government together. But a priori, me personally, I oppose nuclear energy because of the incalculable risk of the spent fuel, which remains radioactive for 100,000 years. But as ICANN, we wouldn't divert resources towards that. We would just focus on entry into force of the ban treaty. But of course, many of our partner organizations focus very much on nuclear energy as well. And we partner up with everybody that wants to support getting rid of nuclear weapons.
So, yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the long way you've gone. It's just, we're always thinking about changing the minds of the politicians, and it's a very important step. But wouldn't it be needed to create a real civil society movement? Because then people in some countries, the big countries that you talk about, will not vote for governments or for parties who are proposing to agree on these treaties. Mm-hmm. Like the United States. I'm not sure. I didn't research on it, but probably this is also a huge thing. And if a lot of these people in this country, like Portugal, France, Italy, the United States, if the people are voting differently and pushing the governments, maybe that's an important part in the future too. What are you doing in these matters?
So the question is basically if we shouldn't kind of push for a much stronger civil society and try and push out political currents or people who don't agree with getting rid of nuclear weapons.
What's the role in like create big social movements?
Yeah.
Because in the end, if the people will not vote for a government that is agreeing, mm-hmm. the government will not, in many cases, propose that, if they're mm-hmm. alone.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, governments always take the path of least resistance, so they're not going to do the right thing if you don't put pressure on them just because they're afraid of getting pressure from the United States or from other nuclear weapon states. That is true. So obviously you need, as big a civil society movement as you can, and ICANN is very much designed to let partner organizations in so that we can grow and can all work together on the specific topic. And then, of course, there's always a trade-off between opening up your campaign for lots of other goals and keeping focus on actually getting something done. No? And so on the one hand, you could also become a lot more political and start, campaigning against specific parties if they don't want to get nuclear weapons banned and so on. So in Germany, for example, I know that the Social Democrats would be quite easy to get them on board. The Greens are already on board. The left is already on board. The issue is more the conservative parties, no? But even there, it's not so easy to generalize because, first of all, survival of humanity should be everybody's business, right? I don't really see why conservatives, even if they don't embrace a progressive agenda, surely they still want to survive. Secondly, churches, Christian organizations, the Vatican, they're not always, on board with many of the progressive struggles, but they're totally on board with banning nuclear weapons. No? So you don't want to shut them out either. You want to take in the support that you can. And certainly, there's also other states like Austria, where they have very questionable migration policies, very questionable integration policies, but still the Conservative Party is the one that actually spearheaded this process on banning nuclear weapons. So sometimes you have weird allies, and that's fine. Like, if that helps you to get this process through the United Nations, I would totally do it again. So, at the beginning, you have to be quite pragmatic about getting these treaties through in order to create a baseline from which to work on. And then hopefully over time we're going to get to a place where we can have a society that is so strong that if a government or if a state doesn't agree with getting rid of nuclear weapons or doesn't agree with other propositions that are important for us to get ahead, that then they basically have to fear the power of the people coming down on them. Yeah.
I'd just like to thank you for your dedication as well to the cause and getting countries in the global south to divest from nuclear weapons, because that's really important. I'm a journalist for an outlet called The Canary, which is an independent outlet, completely independent of big business. And I know that Barclays Bank, for example, has investments in both sides of the nuclear weapons, from Russia to the UK. So the banks are making money on both sides of this conflict, which is something I think is important. And onto a question, I just was wondering if your organization had any information on Israel's unofficial nuclear weapons program, which is kind of kept under the radar and isn't really officially recognized by the UK government or other governments.
Yeah, I mean, so we as ICANN, we didn't find the information ourselves. We work together with people who are quite specialized in these things. So there's the Federation of American Scientists, for example, that do an annual report where they tell you who has how many nuclear weapons. I know, of course, it's been acknowledged for many, many years, since the 70s, that Israel has nuclear weapons of its own. It's probably around between 80 and 120 nuclear weapons. And then you get all kinds of complementary or corroborating information here and there. So, for example, the Germans sold submarines to Israel. Those submarines are nuclear weapon capable. And then the Germans also subsidized those submarines by 30%. So the German taxpayer is basically enabling weapons of mass destruction for Israel. And there's absolutely nothing that the Germans can do to keep them from killing millions of civilians with that. So that's an issue. And something that's always worth drawing attention to, especially since so many people say, oh, we don't know if Israel has nuclear weapons. Well, they're basically wasting your time. Everybody knows that that Israel has nuclear weapons. So I would just, cut the crap and give them short shrift. Like if somebody claims Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons, then they're just playing for time, basically. They're just showing bad faith.
Hey. I saw on your map that India is actually working in favor of your treaty. Could you tell us something more about the process of getting there?
Did they? I think there was just a state that was too close. So that's Nepal that's in favor, Sri Lanka is in favor, Bangladesh would be in favor, but India and Pakistan, basically they abstained from the resolution on whether or not to negotiate this treaty. And the reason why they abstained is quite an interesting one. Basically, they're passive-aggressive here about having been excluded from the NPT, because the NPT says you're only accepted as a nuclear weapon state if you've exploded a bomb before 1968. India and Pakistan happen to have done that after 1968, so they're kind of not part of the club, and they're not allowed to join the NPT unless they first disarm unilaterally. And so by abstaining from this process, they kind of say, hey, look at us, we would engage on nuclear weapons diplomacy if you let us. So it's not very useful.
I would also like a moment for you all to appreciate one another because you're asking badass questions.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
like a little round of applause for all the people who are asking kick-ass things and are really engaged and listening. Super appreciated.
Yeah.
You're doing good. This talk just goes to show how complex these systems are that are at play, that we are, most of us, oblivious about, and the intricacies and specialization that's needed to tackle them. Sometimes not very kind of glorious showmanship kind of stuff that activism often gets promoted around, like the big razzle-dazzle stuff, but it's super important work. So I would like a big round of applause for John Lennon of the anti-nuclear weapons campaign.
Thanks. Thank you, guys.
Leo Axe, ladies and gentlemen.